Hello there, people, new listeners, and returning friends. Welcome to Yoga Talks Podcast. My name is Jay Brown. It's good to be with you again. Thanks for listening. Those of you who listened last week, I have much to report. Last week, if you remember, I made a pain confession. I was in a lot of pain, and I was a bit in trouble. And I told you that as soon as I was done recording, I was going to go to sleep, and I was going to try to muddle through the weekend, and then on Monday I was going to start resting because I knew I needed to rest. Well, you won't believe what happened. I did what I said. I finished recording. I went to sleep right away, and 5 hours later I woke up, and basically I couldn't get out of bed. I mean, I could, but if I was in a seated position or a standing position, there was so much pain in my neck and shoulder and down my arm that all I wanted to do was lay back down. If I laid back down, it would subside some and I would be okay. But there was still pain just laying down too. It was like bad. I was like, oh my God. And as I said last week, I've had that kind of pain before, but it was to a degree that I hadn't had in a long time or maybe ever. And it's amazing what pain does to your mentality. Like when I was talking to you last week, I had that pain and it was pretty bad, but not to the point where I couldn't, like, I don't know. I see, I'm still in denial about it. It was pretty bad last week, but when I woke up, it was really bad. And I had to cancel. I had to cancel 3 days of classes that I was supposed to teach. And, you know, I went to see somebody about it after 2 days because I was really concerned. And I saw somebody, and he was very smart, and he was helpful. He certainly, I felt, did an accurate assessment of what was going on with my anatomy. We did some exercises to try to help things. And, you know, I think it did to some degree, but I also feel like I was very inflamed and I questioned the way that we worked. But more importantly, what I came away with was, while it was good to know about what was going on with my anatomy, I mean, it's good to know that, you know, when my seventh cervical decides to quit, my thoracic outlet gets impinged. And that's sort of the new vogue diagnosis, isn't it? The thoracic outlet syndrome. I don't know if that's what I have or not. I mean, but really, for me, having that information, while sort of helpful because it eases my mind to some degree, it doesn't really tell me how to fix anything. Like, the healing of this pain is not like some corrective fix I'm going to apply to my physiology that's going to suddenly make this go away. So for several days, it's really just been this process of like, well, how much to move and how much not to move, and resting. I've just been resting, and it's gotten better. You know, I'm probably at about, I don't know, 40% of my usual 110% capacity. But that's up from about 25%. So that 15% better is worth a lot. It's like hope. It's getting to get better, you know? Like, I feel like if I just keep doing the right things, it will get better. It's probably going to take longer than I want it to. And I'm certainly reassessing so much. Like, I really have to sort it out. The other part of it, in terms of yoga teachers busting ass to try to make it, is still there, you know? But I've got some ideas to make some changes. I really appreciated those of you who reached out to me about it and sent your emails. In particular, I want to give like a particular shout out to somebody, because somebody did something for me that was really cool. Like, I don't know if you've ever had occasion where, like, you're moving and you put the word out to your friends and you say, I'm moving, and you hear back from some of your friends and they say, oh, I'll totally help you move. And you expect, like, these friends are going to show up, but, like, only maybe, like, that one shows up. There's that one friend who shows up on the day when you're moving and is actually there with a case of beer and helps, Well, I felt like that when I got an email from someone. I'm going to read it to you. The subject line is, looking for a donate here button on your site. Message is, hi Jay, I really enjoy your podcasts. I was wondering how I can support you. The podcast takes time. I would like to contribute to your effort. Thank you, Larissa. So Larissa says, I would like to give you money. And, I hadn't really thought about putting a donate button on the site before, which I'm not sure why. I mean, it's something that I do. I mean, I don't know any of you who might work with websites. I do WordPress sites sometimes, and any of you who've worked on WordPress sites, you can get into the weeds sometimes with the code, and there's these programmers out there who make the plugins, and you can email them, and sometimes they'll hook you up. And when they do, I always hit that donate button because they were just helpful. But I never thought of doing that on my site, so I did. I put a donate button up there, and I emailed Larissa back, and I said, thanks so much. I took you up on your suggestion. And then she went on, and she made a donation, and it was generous. And it really felt like support. She basically bought my family dinner. That's support. That's real support. So thank you, Larissa. I was really touched by that. I really appreciated it. If anybody else wants to show that kind of support, there is now a donate button. And you know what else? There's also this Amazon button I put on there because I realized I also have this Amazon account. I don't know if you guys know these accounts where if you click on that Amazon button, and then it'll take you to the Amazon site, and then you just do whatever shopping you would normally do on Amazon, and I'm sure you guys buy off Amazon like I do. Well, some small percentage of that will go to the podcast. So if you want to donate some money or you want to just do your Amazon shopping by clicking on that link, you will give a little bit of financial support to the podcast, and I really appreciate that. Thanks again, Larissa. So today's talk is with Dianne Bondy, and I had so much fun talking to her. I really utilized my talk with her as an opportunity to educate myself, which I think is a lot of what her work is about, educating people about how to teach to different sort of bodies and sort of people and make yoga accessible. So it's a great conversation, and I'm super excited for you to hear it. And we're going to do another promotional code. And it's funny, those of you who've listened to this podcast and heard the conversations between me and my producer about this kind of thing, we had another one of those conversations about these promo codes and whether or not doing a 10% off promo code somehow kind of devalues the thing and makes it a commodity. And we decided to go ahead and keep doing them. They're just these secret things. They only happen on the podcast. So only people who listen to the podcast get an opportunity to have them. There's nowhere else that they are, just the podcast. So we're doing one today. If you go to jbrownyogavideo.com, you can use promo code BONDY10, BONDY 10, BONDY10, and you'll get 10% off. Any purchase could be the practice videos or the online course. jbrownyogavideo.com. Again, promo code BONDY10. Okay, other than that, next week we're going to be off for 1 week. We're going to be dark. The blog post is going to come out. But the following week, I mentioned Neil Pearson's coming on. We're going to talk more about addressing pain. And I think that's good. Thank you so much for listening. Let's go ahead and talk to Dianne. Well, Dianne, it's nice to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
And, I feel like before we get into the conversation I was hoping to have with you, I have two things I feel like I need to say first, full disclosure things.
Okay.
And the first one is that I kind of have a little crush on you.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah. Ever since I watched that video that you're in for the Penningtons, and we'll talk about that. But ever since I saw the video, and first of all, it's a great video. Whoever made it has some real skills.
for
it's
sure.
just a kick-ass video. Like whenever I watch it, it makes me feel psyched and like empowered and feels good.
Nice.
So I watched it a bunch of times. And then there's actually like this one moment in there where it's just like a shot of your foot in Warrior 2.
Yes.
And like the way the camera pulls away and the way the music is, like whenever I've been doing my own personal practice for like months now, when I'm in Warrior 2, that's in my head. Like you're in my head. You've been in my practice, my personal practice.
Wow.
And I mentioned this to my wife, and she was like all like, oh, and like getting all jealous. And like before I came down here to talk to you, I was like, oh, I'm going to talk to Dianne. She's like, oh, your yoga girlfriend.
Oh, that's funny.
So I just felt like I needed to let that be out. I needed to get that off my chest. And thank you, because I just think that video is really great.
I was really impressed with how it turned out, and it was a really fun day, and the concept was brilliant. I remember when they sent me the concept, I thought, amazing, right? So it was.
Well, I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves because I want to talk about that experience. Yeah. But what I loved about it most, just to tell you to start, which is that I just felt like it captured something very authentic about you.
Oh,
I thought that came through, and that's what I fell in love with. So it's great to talk to you.
Nice.
And actually like have a voice to this person who's been with me in my practice.
Nice.
Now, the other thing is, and this is maybe like, I feel almost a little nervous or uncomfortable, but I feel like I have to mention it, which is that you're the first person of color to ever be on the podcast.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah. Well, you know, the reason is like I looked back over the people who've been in the podcast, and they're all white people.
Sure.
And I said this to my wife, and she said, oh, you're not going to mention that, are you? And I said, no, I totally have to. And she's like, well, won't it be weird? And I was like, no, that's the whole point.
Right,
that's why I have to mention it.
Yeah.
Like we have to talk about these things. And I feel like that's so much what your work is about.
Absolutely. Yeah, that happens a lot. And I think people's perceptions of what Black folks do is kind of, well, it's totally indicated by what we see in media and press. So you don't see any Black folks doing yoga. You just assume Black folks don't do yoga, right?
No, you don't. And honestly, when I think about, this podcast has a lot to do with like the professional yoga world or whatever. Mm-hmm. And when I look at that, it's like the only person I can think is like Faith Hunter, maybe, who I don't know. It's like there's no. Yep. And even, I want to give you an example of where I feel like I have my own blinders. Like I've become very aware of my own white male privilege of late. And even before coming on the podcast, I was like, well, can I say Black person or do I say colored person? Like I had this whole thing in my head about I want to say the right thing. Want.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That happens for everybody. I was teaching a workshop at Omega for the Yoga Service Council, and I had been using the terminology disabled and differently abled bodies, and I didn't realize that differently abled bodies was marginalizing, it was like a benevolent discrimination against people who were disabled. And I mean, I've been using that terminology, I want to say, for the past 2 years. So I totally got schooled on that. But I think the best way to ever approach that is ask people, how they like to be referred to. I'm not about putting labels on anybody, but it's a really kind of general, safe term as of, right now, May 18th, 2016 at 9:10.
Okay.
You can use the term person of color, because I find that that way you don't have to define if somebody is Black and Latino.
See, that's what I chose. I said person of color because that felt the most open to me.
Yes, it really, I think, captures a lot of different ethnicities and is not offensive. I haven't found it to be offensive in any way.
Okay.
And I use that term when I'm referring to anybody of color. So.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I just want to say, since we haven't met before, like if I do say something weird, I want you to feel really comfortable to call me out on it.
Oh, okay.
Just if
I'll do it kindly.
if a red flag in you goes off from something that I say in our conversation, I want you to tell me right in this conversation.
Okay.
I want to be educated about it, and I want to give you an invitation to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That so rarely happens. So.
Well, no, that's my whole feeling about talking to you, because that does seem to me to be so much about what your work is about in terms of acceptability and sensitivity to different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So before we get to what we already started to get to, I always I like to talk to people about their entrance into yoga. And I did read something about you. Like I read an interview with you. Mm-hmm. And in the interview, it was like a really quick interview where just like quick answers, question, answer. But you mentioned your father.
Yeah.
And I know that my mother and dealing with things with my mother played this huge role in what my yoga is. And it sounded from this answer, this very short answer, that was true for you with your father.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I haven't had a great relationship with my dad, and he, like as a woman and as a female child, your dad kind of sets up, helps you establish part of your self-esteem, helps you learn to communicate with people who are of a different gender than you. And I didn't have that with my dad. He wasn't one of those hands-on, touchy-feely, lovey kind of dads. He was really kind of aloof. And I think for the most part, he told us when we were kids he didn't really want to be a dad. So he really just kind of...
Well, I just talked with Matthew Remsky recently, and I was saying to him that, my dad didn't change any diapers.
Yeah.
I've changed plenty.
Yes. My husband, too. Probably more than me, to be honest. If I'm really calling it. But... I didn't have one of those kinds of dads. So,
Well, the other thing that you mentioned in this interview that really touched me or whatever resonated with me was that it mentioned specifically about how he made you feel about your body.
Yeah, for sure. He was a big player. He was a big factor in my, my hate of myself, because he made it a point to embarrass me and call me up and shame me every opportunity he got. So, that played a role and stayed with me for a good 30 years, I would say.
And it seemed to me that yoga played a big role in addressing that.
Absolutely. It was absolutely my saving grace around that, for sure.
And so how did that happen for you? Like, I also noticed that you were a Pilates teacher. Were you a Pilates teacher before you were a yoga teacher, or did those things happen at the same time?
Oh, no. I live here in Canada, and when I was in high school, I took a class called fitness in the 12th grade. And at the fitness class was just like running and swimming. It was like hell. I didn't know what I was signing up for, but I thought it was a good idea to get some fitness. So we get to school before school, and you'd either have to run like 3 miles or you'd have to swim the pool for an hour or whatever. And I got really into it, and I really enjoyed it. And then we had an opportunity to take what was called a leadership course in fitness, and they kind of taught you how to teach group fitness classes. So I could take it for extra credit in high school, and I did. And then I started teaching fitness classes in the gym after school. So I started teaching group fitness when I was 17 as part of like extra credit for my fitness course at school. And from then on, I always just taught some kind of movement class. So, I just kind of went with how the trends went. So it was group fitness, and it was like jazzercise kind of thing. And then we evolved to step aerobics, and then we evolved to group cycling. And then we had this whole thing called the slide for a while. And then there was boot camp. So I did all those types of activities through my late teens and 20s. And when around my 30s, like I always had yoga. My mom introduced me to yoga when I was about 3. So I always had that kind of playing in the background.
Was like the adjunct thing, right?
Yeah.
I stretch out after my workout.
Exactly.
Yeah, see, I think that happens a lot with yoga, that people just think of it as that.
And that's all it was. It was just kind of stretching. My mom and I used to do this in the basement. I would get home from whatever activities I was doing, and she said, we should stretch out, we should breathe. And she introduced me to meditation and all that good stuff. But I always had that kind of as part of my practice, but I never taught it until I came into my 30s and I got pregnant with my first son. And I said to my husband, I'm super stressed and I want to have a natural, birth. And he had mentioned to me prior to getting pregnant that we needed to do something that would help reduce stress, because I had a very stressful job as a accountant for the government. So
you were an accountant for the government, is that what you said?
I was, yeah. I worked
and you taught fitness.
And I taught fitness on the side. I taught fitness on the side for decades. I actually think I've been teaching some kind of movement class for the past 30 years.
Wow. So, wow, I didn't know you were an accountant.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense, because you're savvy business-wise. I want to talk to you about that later.
Okay.
I appreciate that a lot. Anyway, I get ahead of myself. So, anyways, back to what you were saying. So you were a fitness instructor, and then you had yoga in the background, and then you got pregnant. And I think that happens a lot. Like when women get pregnant, yoga sort of becomes more important sometimes?
It did. I wanted to have a natural birth. I had a doula, and I wanted to have a natural birth. So I needed to come back to my yogic breathing, and I needed to come back to being able to focus and to work through things that are uncomfortable. And those are the things that yoga teaches us. So I circled back around to my yoga practice, which is, like I said, always been in the background, maybe not always at the forefront of my life, but always somewhere in my life. So I said I wanted to come back to that so that I could have my birth naturally. I had a big fear of having a big needle placed into my spine, and I had a few of my friends who had negative experiences with epidurals, and I just didn't want to do that. If I could do this as naturally as possible, that's what I wanted, and I was really successful with that with both my children. So
fantastic. And so, where did that happen for you? Was there a particular center or teacher that when did it become more formal and not just you and your mom in the basement stretching?
I practiced by myself for a really long time, and I didn't actually step into a yoga studio till after the birth of my second son. Like, I never felt I needed to go out into the world and practice with somebody. I don't know why. I read all the textbooks.
Yeah.
I just did my own thing. I taught yoga to myself from my textbook. So I had my fitness training in the background, so I could kind of, know my anatomy, what was safe for me to do and not to do. But I didn't actually dive into the full experience of yoga probably until my first son was maybe 3 months old, and I went into a yoga studio, and I just had a baby, and I was having all kinds of body image issues, and I just remember going in there and signing up and having people look me over and tell me that I wasn't going to be able to do this or make a judgment based on what I looked like.
Yeah.
And so that was super uncomfortable. And
so that's where it kind of starts, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's like you have this self-practice by yourself.
Forever, for years. Yeah.
And that's totally, to me, very authentic. I mean, we always have this discussion of what's authentic, but you finding your own yoga by yourself at home through your own inquiry, I don't know, it's hard to argue anything more authentic than that.
Thanks. It was a really amazing experience. I had a mother who was really open to meditation and yoga and, kind of always following our own path. She was really supportive of all that stuff. So it didn't seem foreign to me to be doing this. We kept it kind of a secret because at the time in the Black community, and my mother's
That's what I'm saying. Did you have any friends who were doing it with you? You were just on your own? You were this...
Totally on my own with my mom or by myself. Like, it was never a group activity, ever.
And then going to the yoga scene, what year was that? Can you remember what year it was when you went to a yoga center?
It would have been 2007.
Okay, so by that time... things are what they are. And,
yeah.
And that must have been quite a thing to walk into a center and get judged.
I was so nervous to go in there. And then I thought to myself, I had been reading all this philosophy and practicing all this, the spiritual practices. I thought, no, this is a spiritual practice. Everybody's going to be super welcoming and nobody's going to make any judgments. But really, high school plays out everywhere. And that's exactly what it was. It was
I know. And let's be fair. There are centers that might have been the case.
Yeah.
There are centers and teachers where you might not have come up against it like you did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Depending on where you went. So where did you go? What was the center?
I went to the most popular and most established yoga studio in my town at the time. Right. And that was the only one I knew. That was the one I heard everybody talk about. So I went to go to this yoga center, and it was it was an experience, to say the least. But
so did you continue to take classes there? Did you go somewhere else? Where did you end up? Did you end up finding a teacher that you really liked, or...
Well, how I ended up finding a teacher is because I had been kind of teaching yoga classes, calling it stretch class, calling it breathing class for a long time. And I had taught in like fitness centers. So you couldn't really at that time call it yoga. They didn't want any spirituality with it. Just call it stretch class. So I did that for a while. And then just based on my own personal practice and my fitness background, I just kind of made it work. Then after I had my son and I went to the yoga studio, I thought to myself, I need to take some kind of formal training before I move forward because maybe I don't understand everything there is to know.
Just check yourself, just make sure you got it right.
Make sure I got it right. Make sure I know what I'm talking about. So at that point, I found a yoga teacher, Linda Makowski from Royal Oak. She has a studio, Namaste, the oldest actually studio in Detroit. And I went and practiced with her. And I specifically picked that studio because it had been around for a while. And it had a philosophy of teaching more accessible classes, meaning I found that the Ashtanga practice was really only for the really fit, right? Like you had to be able to do these poses.
So if it was super Ashtanga heavy or like super power vinyasa only, then you would sort of, it only lend to certain sorts of people.
It did. I could keep up with all those practices. I've always been very strong.
Yeah, you were already a fitness person, so you could hold your own, I'm sure.
I could hold my own for sure. I might not know exactly what the primary series is because I dabbled in everything. So, I might not know that, or I might not know the exact terminology prior to this. But I tried to pick a place that had something that was more well-rounded. So we had an introduction to Ian. We had an introduction to prenatal yoga. We had an introduction to chair yoga. We were taught vinyasa. We were taught hatha. It was a year-long teacher training, and I said, okay, this is for me because I'm going to get a little bit of everything. Right. The other yoga studios in the area were primarily teaching Ashtanga Vinyasa, and it was a 3-month intensive practice, and at the end of 3 months, they send you out in the world to teach yoga, and I felt like, I want to take my time with this. I need time for stuff to settle.
Yeah, your whole reason you were coming to it wasn't to push yourself.
No.
You already knew what that was to do that.
Absolutely.
And you were looking for a practice that was something different than that.
Absolutely. And I wanted to learn more about the philosophy. I wanted to understand deeper what I was reading and what was important to share in the yoga practice with everybody. And I just felt that my training at Namaste was so well-rounded. And what I loved is the teacher who taught me was openly gay, and she was older, and so it was somebody I hadn't seen before in the position of a teacher, which really spoke to me, right?
That's so important, because I really think that teachers are examples and models for what they teach, and
absolutely.
So someone who comes from that place and then teaches, that must have been a powerful...
It was amazing. I don't think I could have had a better introduction into yoga than with Linda. And I also was paired up at the time in my teacher training. Kid Rock's brother was taking teachers at the same time.
Kid Rock's brother is a yoga teacher?
He dropped out half the course. Because he got into a master's program at Wayne State, so he decided to go and take a master's of education about halfway through our yoga teacher training. But
probably a good choice, actually.
Right? Yeah. So I'm sure he's probably off to his PhD by now. But he was in our class, and he had had an accident as a child where his leg was severed at the hip. And he had one leg, and he never wore a prosthetic, and he would just come in on crutches. And I was always paired up with him in teacher training. So I had to work with somebody in a disabled body. And it was just like right out the gate. And
I had a student who was the same. It was at the knee, he was amputee, and we worked together for a little while. So it really was I remember that was the first time I was like, wow, I have to be able to change what I do to fit to people better.
Absolutely. And that was my first introduction to looking at yoga differently, because I was looking at yoga from my perspective of a very physical, strong, able body. And I had never given any consideration to the fact that somebody else would want to do yoga or wanted access to yoga in a body that was disabled. So, whenever I use that term disabled, I don't think of Billy that way. I mean, he did everything. He had a strong vinyasa practice.
Yeah, they can do. He did. My friend who I worked with, he could do everything. Mostly. I mean, we had to make some changes, but still,
Yes, he was a really good lesson for me, and it changed the way I looked at people's bodies, and it changed the way that I looked at myself, and it changed the way I looked at the word ability. Because in my mind, he didn't seem disabled because he was like one of the stronger practitioners in every way in our class. So
is there a better word than disabled? Like you said, you said person of color is good. Should we not say disabled if they're not disabled?
I think we should say disabled. Like I said, I just recently got schooled on this.
Yeah.
And I think I was told by somebody to call it what it is. And I think that's right now what the acceptable term is. And if anybody knows if there's another term.
That's right. If anybody listening please has a more appropriate term, tell me, and I'll make sure Dianne gets it too, right?
Right?
Okay. Fair enough. Well, it does seem, just as a quick side note, it does seem like so much of the kind of movement and talk in the yoga world about accessibility in classes and trauma sensitivity, it does have to do with language, right?
Yes, yes. And I have to say, language is one of the only ways that we are still able to place judgments on people or perpetuate ideas of racism, sexism, ableism, all the isms that you can possibly think of. Language is the only way that, or is the most popular way that we set these boundaries on people. So I always want to be really conscious of that I am not continuing to perpetuate these ideas. And I want to be open to hearing everybody's perspective, even if I don't agree with it or I can't resonate with it. I think it's important that we hear everybody with compassion and empathy, right?
Me too. I completely agree. That's awesome. So, okay, so you do this teacher training for a year. It sounds like a really good training. And when you're done with it, you finally feel comfortable to say, I'm a yoga teacher?
No, I still felt like a fraud. I don't know. And even to this day, I always cringe when people, or if somebody refers to me as a professional or whatever. I don't feel that. I share what I know. I'm always evolving and learning.
Yeah. But that's what it means to be a professional yoga teacher.
I guess so. My yoga teacher cornered my husband. We were at a workshop together because I went on from taking my 200 hours straight into Anusara training. And I was in that for 5 years.
Oh, wait a second. So after that teacher training, you did Anusara training also?
Yeah. I did, because again, I felt like I still don't know enough. I did 200 hours.
See, sometimes that's the case, right? Sometimes yoga is so vast, it feels like you can't know enough.
I couldn't know enough, and I didn't feel I knew quite enough to do what I was doing, even though I was already teaching yoga classes. Like, I had rented a space in my local church. I had rented out the church hall, and I had asked all my friends to come out and do yoga with me. And my neighbors were amazing. My son was really little, and I put him in the stroller, and I printed off 100 flyers, and I just went around the neighborhood putting it in people's mailboxes and taping it on, lampposts and doing all that kind of stuff. So I had already been teaching while I was
You were
a teacher.
DIY back in the day, man.
For real, though.
Yeah, that's serious. There was no social media back then, huh?
There wasn't, no.
Yeah.
And I was just out there, and I'd put up a poster at the grocery store, and I put up a poster at a community center, and I got about 12 people out to my first class, and I thought that was good. That was enough.
That's perfect.
And I wrote out all my classes, and I had everybody be in a circle, and I sat in the middle of the room, and I went through these poses. And then as I evolved, as teacher training happened, and I would come back to my class, I would say, okay, we learned this week in teaching, and I want to try it out on everybody, right? And so my core students, who a lot of them still practice with me today, were there at the very beginning when I was just kind of fumbling my way through it based on being self-taught. And then I jumped into Anusara, and I was in that world for a long time.
How deep did you get into Anusara? Because that was a world.
Too deep.
Really?
Too deep. I posted it on my Instagram page yesterday that I've kind of been jaded by the guru principle. I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine around this, because I followed John Friend around the country. I followed all the senior Anusara teachers. I think Anusara is an amazing system of alignment.
The spirals were cool, man. The spirals were cool.
They were cool, and there was all this cool stuff, and the idea of celebrating self and lifting
grace.
Up and
we really into grace. I always appreciated that.
Right, opening to grace. All of that spoke to me. And then when all this ugliness happened with Anusara and, all this stuff came out, I was kind of on my way out of that feeling part of that community.
Wait a second. So before this came out, did you have doubts about being so entrenched there? Because what I feel like the situation is because of the sort of culture that was created, or wherever that comes from with Anusara, you were really identified. There was to leave Anusara meant leaving your friends or something. It wasn't. And I was talking with Matthew recently about his experiences in two different, what he referred to as cults, and how he said the same thing, that part of the reason he stayed for so long is it meant leaving so much in a certain sense,
Oh yeah. And it was funny. The first time I went to an Anusara workshop with John Friend, my husband, it was in Toronto, and my husband said to me, please don't drink the Kool-Aid. That's what he said to me. He was always like, I don't know about this guy. Yeah. He was always, I'm like, you know what? You don't really practice yoga as much as I do. I gave this whole speech, right? He's like, okay, go have your thing. And I went, and I came back, and I said, not only did I drink the Kool-Aid, I sprayed it everywhere I could. And I was taken in by the cult of personality. I mean,
were you aware of anything other than the image? Were you
no,
aware?
at that point, no. This would have been maybe 2009.
So
And
you just found out with the scandal. You didn't have any. Because sometimes I think when you're in a thing for a long time, you start to realize, oh, there's kind of another side to it.
I had noticed that because what had ended up happening is I think right before the scandal broke, the year before the scandal broke, my friend and I went to study with him in Miami. He was at the University of Florida, and we went down to Miami and studied with him. And when I was in it with all these other people, for the first time ever, I kind of noticed what was going on. And a group of us ended up having lunch together, and I brought it up at this lunch, and a few of us were like, I see it too. And I'm like, a couple of them weren't certified teachers or Anusara inspired teacher, which is as far as I got. And they were saying they were. So
you were never like officially certified. You were inspired.
I was inspired. I at the point of inspiration, I was just like, I'm no longer inspired by this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
my inspiration has waned.
The fog has lifted, and I'm now seeing what I'm seeing.
And that was before like the whole scandal came out.
I see. The year before it fell apart, and I had started drifting. And I think what really was a catalyst for me, my Anusara teacher, my main teacher at the time, had become disillusioned. So she had started talking about some of the things that she had witnessed in Anusara. And then when she started mentioning that, and then I went to this workshop and I started to see what she was talking about, then I was out. Like, I didn't even stay for the last day of training. I bailed out and went to the beach because I knew at that point I was kind of done.
Wow. So you didn't even finish, but you just the last day?
The last day I bailed out. Yeah. I watched, it was like a week-long training, and I was like, I see what my teacher's saying, so I'm actually not as interested in this.
So that was kind of like a statement.
Yeah. I love it. It's hard to be it's hard to be in Florida. And I live on the East Coast, and it's cold here a lot of the time. We get 3 months for summer or whatever. So it was really hard to be in a warm climate and not buy into the dogma that was going on, and then to be able to see the water from where you were sitting. I'm like, I'm out. I'm going to see what's over there. And I just left. Yeah.
And so in Anusara, did you come up against like judgments about you and your body and stuff?
You know what? Not really. I have to say, it was so entrenched in the loops and the spirals and the philosophy. I never felt like anybody judged me based on my body. I can't say I felt that when I was
cool.
there.
That's great. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that you felt welcome.
Plus size. Yeah, I didn't feel. And my Anusara teacher too was bigger as well. Like she wasn't your typical, what you would consider, the stereotypical yoga body. So that made it really acceptable to me. And she was older as well. The thing was, she was super strong and super flexible. And she did mention her body a few times. She did say, I'm sure I have 50 pounds to lose or whatever. But it did, body image certainly came up. And she was certainly self-deprecating about her body while teaching, which I think also can be problematic in sending messages to your students.
Well, I just think that I asked the question because I feel like the whole discussion is a relatively new discussion in the yoga world.
Absolutely.
And I just don't remember I don't remember teachers asking if they could touch anybody before they touched them.
Never.
And I don't remember any discussions about any of this.
No.
Back even in 2009, which isn't that long ago.
Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. So when I'm trying to get to the point when you decide that you can call yourself a yoga teacher, are we there yet?
I think when I left Anusara, I thought it was the most freeing experience because then I could dabble in the cross-pollination of all practices, because there was this really staunch belief in Anusara that if you're an Anusara teacher, you could only do Anusara. And
was that part of it? I didn't know. Was there like a real loyalty thing built in?
Absolutely. And as a culture, the Anusara culture was really critical of other types of yoga. And the funny thing is, right in the mission statement, it would say, never speak poorly about another teacher, never speak poorly about another style of practice. But when you were, the literature said that, but when you were in it, people were really disparaging about other practices, So it was nice to be.
But you had already had that other training prior to that. So
exactly. And I had already had my own practice prior to that. So I didn't necessarily buy into it. I thought there was lots of great alignment and philosophy tips, which were really close to, what Iyengar taught, or even borrowed from the Iyengar practice if we're, if we're being honest. But I was so freed. And I think by that time I felt like I was teaching yoga. Like I was not just out there teaching asana. So for so long, I called myself an asana teacher. So
isn't that interesting? I've heard that before where people, it's actually something I'm writing about right now where people say, I teach an asana class.
Yes.
And I have a kind of an issue with it. Like can we really separate asana from yoga? And if we can, then what's the purpose? What's the purpose of asana without it being yoga?
Well, if we look back at the creation of asana, like if we look at the history of the creation of asana, if you look back to the British colonizing India and the Indian population feeling oppressed and wanting to get stronger to push back against their oppression, that's when the introduction of asana really happens. Asana is only maybe 150 years old. It's not something when people are talking about the 5,000-year old practice.
I mean, that's not entirely true. Like, it depends on what you're talking about, because there's people on caves, carvings on caves from thousands of years ago of somebody in a cross-legged position.
I've seen people in wheels in the pyramids in Africa, which then again goes back to who discovered yoga, right? Because we're seeing, right? So who... And I mean,
I guess this is a kind of getting us into the weeds a little bit, but I guess for me, the point I guess I'm making is that you would not call yourself a yoga teacher and say, I teach an asana class. But that word asana is comes from yoga. It's not like stretch. Right? It's not like fitness. It's asana, pranayama. You know what I mean?
But what is the definition of asana? The definition of asana is a seat, right? To take a seat. That's the literal definition of it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean vinyasa, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Right? So if we're taking a seat in our own awareness or we're taking our seat in our knowledge of the world, then essentially we're doing asana, right?
Okay.
I'm just saying.
I like the case you're making. I like the case you're making for just pure asana, no yoga. But I don't know. I feel like those two things are related at the very least.
They're definitely related, and they're definitely part of the 8-limb path. It's the third limb on the path, right?
Yeah.
But yoga is not asana, and asana is not yoga. The two of them, the philosophy, the awareness, your consciousness, the lifting of your consciousness, the sharing of consciousness, I think that's where the yoga lies, and asana is a part of that, I think. And I think if you're just going to a class and teaching a power flow and not interspersing philosophy or not asking people to sit in self-reflection or self-awareness, then I think maybe you're just teaching asana. What do you think about that, Jay?
Well, no, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question because someone just asked me the other day in an interview. They're like, it sounds to me like you like to bring in the spiritual aspects of practice more.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, yes, but I don't know what they mean when they say that. Like, I'm not talking about Ganesh or, I'm not talking about sutras or the Bhagavad Gita in my class.
Sure.
But I am talking about mindset and whether or not we're trying to go past an edge physically or whether we're setting a boundary and working within that.
And that, don't you think that's part and parcel to the practice of yoga? Isn't that?
I do. And to me, that's me talking about the spiritual aspects, but in a way that's accessible.
Absolutely. And that's what we have to do. We live in North America. Our culture is different. The way we think about things are different. Western culture is very different from South Asian culture. So we can bring the essence of the teaching to North America.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.